The moon that night hung thin and pale over the cane like a sickle, and the fields breathed a slow heat that tasted of molasses and iron. In the yard, the cicadas kept a steady, impatient hymn. At the house, the shutters were closed against the wind, and the world held its breath. Perpétua walked the veranda as one who measured stones, each step precise, each glance an accounting. She was a woman grown sharp by loss and hunger, the widow of a coronel whose ledger had named her Mistress, and whose absence had left her with a map of power and a hollow like a missing tooth. Where he had ruled with whip and ledger, she ruled with a history of being watched and a new cruelty that wore the color of order. Beneath the house, in the low, fragrant rooms where lamps were oil and voices were quick to husk, the men and women who lived under her roof moved like breath in a body. They worked when the sun demanded it and kept their conversations to the folds of night. Among them, Benedito kept a secret like a confession, letters written small and neat, the only inheritance of a late teacher who had once bent over him like a merciful shadow. He wrote on used paper, on bark, on the margins of flour sacks. He learned the shape of words the way others learned the shape of songs, with hands that trembled and eyes that kept watch. If literacy was a blade, he did not brandish it, he hid it. Stay until the end, subscribe and like to remember. Perpétua's house smelled of steam from the kitchen and of the expensive tobacco she kept rolled in the drawer by the parlor door. She wore widow's black in a way that made sin possible, in the quiet that followed her arrangements. People said her tongue had turned to a kind of calculation. The ciata boards of the veranda remembered her tread. She called for the four, Amaro, Benedito, Geronimo, Masu, one by one, with a voice that mixed command and something like need. The summons came at midnight, when the air was a thick cloth, and the senzala had fallen into small roused rhythms, a child's cough, the scrape of a cup, a distant dog whining. They came because refusal was not a language practiced in that place. They came because the mistress's summoning had become a measure, sometimes punishment, sometimes a test of obedience, sometimes a cruel demonstration that black bodies existed at her peril. They came with the smell of sweat still clinging, with the sugar-cane fibers in their hair. Amado's shoulders were broad from hauling, his hands large enough to cup a child's head. Geronimo moved with a slackness at his mouth that had long ago learned how to keep its pain inside. Masu wore a round scar upon his cheek like a lost coin, and at night he hummed prayers to orishas beneath the bedboards. Joanna watched from the low doorway, a quiet witness with her palms folded as if to keep them from speaking. There was something more between her and Benedito than the house permitted, something untamed and patient. Perpétua pushed, and when she pushed, it was with the precision of a woman who had learned to call the moon to account. The room she summoned them into had shutters drawn tight against the stars. The air inside pressed closely to the skin and muffled sound. It had been a chamber where the late coronel had once received travelers and signed papers. Its table still bore the stain of ink, the edge worn. Perpétua sat, wore a face of cold deliberation, and she asked for obedience in a voice that was almost civil. When the door closed, the only sound was the soft clack of a cup placed upon saucer and the rasp of a fan. What followed was not spoken aloud at the senzala at dawn. It was a transaction of bodies and silences. The manners rooms kept their own memory. The mattress remembered the shape of many things. Benedito learned, later, that a man could be pushed until the spirit curled and drew its knees to its chest, that shame could be pressed into a kind of heavy quiet that did not leave when the body was free. He learned it as he watched Amaro go first, as he watched Masu return with his hands trembling and eyes bright with a fearful light. Geronimo did not speak at all. Joanna covered her face and counted, under breath, the beads of a rosary she never invoked before noon. They did not speak of the event that night. They stitched around it like old women mending a wound they dare not show the air. The assault, no word in the house could name it openly, seemed to steal pieces of themselves. Afterward, in the dim days, Benedito's hands shook, not with fear of the whip, but with the memory of the room that stole pieces of soul. He folded the paper tighter then, pressed the nib of his pen harder, and wrote with a steadiness that was both prayer and conspiracy. Night, for them, had always been the hour of stories. Sometimes it was a chorus of the old country, sometimes a litany of saints. Now it became the hour of writing. Benedito taught in the shadows. He drew letters for Amaro in the soot at the hearth, explaining how shapes could be anchors. He taught Joanna to fold her hands and follow the rhythm of vowels. They read the scraps of newspapers that drifted in like flotsam, words about a world beyond the plantation where debates happened and old hierarchies trembled. The law of words offered a different kind of passage. It was slow, it required patience, and it asked for secrecy. Masu, who kept a small cabasa behind the cook stove where he placed things sacred to Ogun and Shango, began to collect the macabres. Folded papers. They were small. Notes that held names and numbers, petitions and the outlines of what Alforria might look like. The community spoke of quilombos in curt, hopeful whispers, of rivers that let a person move through the world like an arrow loosed free. Benedito wrote more than he dared recite. Pleas addressed to men who might have money or the habit of listening. Drafts of appeals, copied signatures which he had learned to forge with gentle hands. These letters were not yet proof. They were seeds. The true proof, when it came, would be small and finished, bound by a signature and a stamp, the shape of the law made material. Perpétua was not merely cruel. She was a woman trapped within the architecture of a fading order. There were nights when she cried in the parlor like someone unsatisfied by tears, when she called the portraits of her dead husband by name and accused them of leaving her. Her cruelty sometimes wore the face of a wound other women might have recognized. Abuse that had been folded into marriage became, in her hands, an attempt to restore dominion. She kept the house's ledger like a talisman. She kept also a secret. Letters of the late coronel that hinted at property claims and a way to increase her holdings. Domingos Ferraz, a pragmatist who had climbed from the market stalls of the nearest town into a position of modest influence, began to appear more often at the estate. He had the look of a man who understood negotiation. He offered words that sounded like economy, not morality. The arrival of Domingos altered the tenor of things. He liked his shirts clean, his chin trimmed, his promises pragmatic. He spoke to Perpétua in the language of contracts and numbers, and she listened as if each offer might plug the hollow in her chest. He met the man of the senzala with a certain polite detachment, making small talk about work and health, yet always watching Benedito's hands as if he suspected their ability. One afternoon, after the day's labor under a sun that had burned sugar-bright across the fields, Domingos lingered near the senzala and watched the men as they mended baskets. He asked subtly about their names, learned to pronounce them as if offering a courtesy. To Benedito, the man offered a new kind of danger, the possibility that someone could listen differently. Joanna had once been a servant in the house of the coronel before the change of fortunes pushed her to the senzala, where she found herself more at home with the night songs than with polite plates. She kept vigil at a window that faced the road and learned the pattern of arrivals. She watched Domingos with an unease that felt like prophecy. She watched Perpétua with something that could have been pity if pity had not been complicated by revenge. Joanna and Benedito found comfort in each other's presence. Quiet, careful touches at the hem of garments, notes passed in the dark when hands met under the pretense of carrying water. Their intimacy was not the lust that the house feared. It was a mutual tending, a gathering of small strengths. The cabazza with the papers grew heavier. Benedito would press his ear to its hollow and imagine the river, hearing the secret and carrying it. The papers were written in the small hand of necessity. Names, dates, a petition that begged for recognition of manumission, an affidavit, the signature of which would be worth more than any palmful of coins. They were evidence of a different future, or if not evidence, then a blueprint. At times Benedito wondered if the letters themselves were alive. At dawn he would find them damp with dew, as if the night had breathed on them. Rumors in the region shifted like the weather. News of emancipation in other places arrived by slow, racked channels. Sailors with accents, travelers with newspapers folded awkwardly under their arms. These whispers were fuel and fear. A man named Silveira in a neighboring estate had received alforria for 2 of his field hands after lengthy bargaining and a payment that felt like blood. Tales of quilombos, small defiant communities hidden in the mangrove and forest, both terrified and inspired. To the people of the Senzala, the very idea of the river was a prayer. It promised travel and a speed that the cane could not give. Perpétua, meanwhile, tightened the screws. She began to inspect the Senzala's drawers for contraband, to harass the cook about spices gone missing, to demand exact returns on labor quotas. Some days the capataz, a man with a face as flat as a board, would go into the fields and return with a complacent swagger that suggested satisfaction with the order he maintained. He carried a whip, though he used it sparingly. He used it sometimes as a punctuation, a reminder of the ledger's presence. Other days Perpétua staged small cruelties. She would invite the men to the house for tasks beyond their duty, and then scold them for failing to meet a standard she had never communicated. It was as if she were testing the strength of the men as one might test the weave of a cloth. Amaro dreamed of water. His mother had told him, when he was small, about the sea, and how it had a voice that could carry a man away. He kept that voice inside, and sometimes at night hummed a song that suggested movement. He knew the map of escape not as a plan, but as feeling, where the road met a thin stand of trees, where a quiet ford let water cover the tracks. He wanted to get away, yes, but he also wanted to take those he loved with him. He promised Joanna, in whispers beneath the eaves, that he would see if a ship might take them north. The plan was always a mosaic of maybes. The payment, the nights when the guard was dull, the rumor of a sympathetic sailor. Benedito, more cautious, thought in terms of paper. There were names to secure, signatures to fashion, men of means who might be persuaded or purchased. He had learned that a single document could change the weather of a person's life as surely as a season could change the crop. He wanted to be free, surely, but he wanted also to take the cabasa of papers out into the light. Every night he wrote drafts and then hid the final copies in the cabasa, which Masu smothered with the residue of rituals, a fig leaf, a bone, a bead of red thread. For Masu, the cabasa was not only a hiding place, but an altar. To him, the letters were as sacred as a petition to the orishas. He spoke often of Shango's sense of justice and Ogun's favor in making a way where there was none. One evening, when heat had made the air between the cane alive and drony, a storm came from the sea. Lightning shivered through the air like a judgment, and the servants gathered in the cookhouse as rain hammered the roof. In that small place, the cabasa was accidentally knocked, and a folded corner of paper fluttered out like a butterfly losing its way. Joanna found it and read a line to Benedito that made them both still. Whereas I, Domingos Ferraz. It was not yet a finished alforria, but a draft, a promise perhaps, and the name startled them. They had not imagined the name of the man who had begun to frequent the house printed upon their path to freedom. Domingos had come that day with an air of willful business. He had spoken at length with Perpétua about sugar yields and loan repayments. He had lingered into the afternoon as if to ensure their agreement. On a pretext, he had walked the yard and then offered a short, sly grin to Benedito, who had been sweeping the steps. The grin had been like a key inserted into a lock, and in the days that followed, Benedito imagined the lock turning. The night Perpétua pushed them to the limit happened not as a sudden thunderclap, but like a drawn knife. She summoned the four once more, and behind her sat the same quiet of the room. and a candle that sputtered as if protesting the truth it would have to see. She spoke of debts, of the house's dwindling ability to pay for help, of the need to find a buyer for certain labors, and then, in a softer voice, she said the thing that emptied their bellies. The man who would purchase their service would demand certain favors, she said, and if they refused, she would find other means to extract value. The words were like cold water poured over coals, sudden, precise, calculated. It was not the offering of the body alone, it was a humiliation wrapped inside a bargain. The men felt the room close. Inward. Amato's knuckles whitened. Masu muttered something to himself and placed a bead between finger and thumb as if to count his prayers. Geronimo's face went flat and distant. Benedito wanted to speak. He wanted to say that no ledger could own a man's flesh, that no signature could account for his soul. But the words lodged where the pen had lodged before, ink dried upon the throat. Perpetua's face did not change. She showed no satisfaction in cruelty, only a steady consumption of a math she had learned in mourning. After that night, the muscles of the senzala tightened in an almost ritual way. They did not sleep well. The farm's rhythms seemed to careen and then settle, like a cart that had lost a wheel and then found another way. Benedito worked as he always had under the sun, but at night he wrote with a new fierceness. The letters he wrote became not only a route to freedom, but a record of injury. He penned the events in small, precise phrases, names of men who had witnessed, dates, the nature of coercion as he could best describe without exposing the vulnerable beyond repair. He wrote with the idea that if at some point a transaction were offered, if Domingos or some other man could be made to purchase their freedom, then there would be evidence to press into the hand of a law clerk or sympathetic official. He wrote with the hope that paper could be a lever. It was in this landscape of tension that Benedito decided he must open a door that had been kept closed. Domingos had been to the house more often. His shoes were now dusty with cane, and his talk had changed from sugar to possibilities. Benedito arranged to meet him one afternoon under the pretext of tending an errand at the town market. He rehearsed his words in the well of his mind and tucked the cabas's smallest papers inside his shirt like an amulet. At the market, Domingos was at ease among clerks and clients, speaking with the tone of a man who had made transactions his sacrament. He wore a linen shirt that had never seen a day in the fields and a belt that hinted at wealth. He listened when Benedito spoke, registering the syllables and pausing at the places that mattered. Benedito did not ask for alforria in the way a man might beg for mercy. Instead, he presented a far more dangerous thing, a negotiation. He told Domingos that the house had secrets, that there were papers that could change the value of holdings, that certain outcomes might be preferable to violence. He offered, with a courage that surprised himself, a bargain: money, quiet, the handing of the cabasa. Domingo's face remained the color of parchment. "You think you have leverage," he said softly, as if playing at a courtly game. "I think I have proof," Benedito answered. He laid out the shape of a plan, signatures to be arranged, an exchange that could produce documents of alforria for those named. He did not tell Domingos of Perpetua's other abuses, only that the truth of the house might be used to rouse trouble and that trouble cut profit. Domingos considered the proposal like a man weighing sugar content in a sample. The risk versus reward calculation was immediate to him. "Why should I put myself in such danger?" Domingos asked. "Why risk the law or a scandal?" "Because a petition in the right hand," Benedito replied, "makes a man move differently. Because men will pay to sleep without fear of scandal. Because you may want to buy for reasons we do not know." Domingos smiled then, a thin, dangerous expression. He recognized opportunity. to gain influence, to broker a transaction that would place him between property and promise, to be the hand that extended freedom for a price. He asked for time to consider, and when he left the market, Benedito felt both relief and a tremor of dread. He had crossed a line. Back at the estate, life continued to thrum and press. The cane burned gold in the late light. Perpétua observed Domingos with a hawk's eye, not yet suspicious, but stung by the suspicion that someone might read her ledger differently than she did. The men of the senzala moved with an extra wariness, for the illusion of safety had been traded for a new kind of danger. Masu continued his rites, humming into the night and laying a small stone by the cabasa. Joanna rechecked knots and folds and the secure place where Benedito kept his papers and his heart. The river, as always, offered its song in the evenings, a low, tearing hush that made one imagine travel and the shedding of burdens. Benedito sat one night upon its bank and let the air take him. He knew that words on paper were both fragile and lethal. They could set a man free, or they could be turned into evidence of complicity. The cure was in the choosing who to trust, choosing when to reveal, choosing to step beyond the margin where the house held them. When Domingos finally answered, it was with a letter folded small and delivered by a man whose shoes told of keeping other people's errands. He asked to meet Benedito at the house at dusk, in the parlor where papers had once been signed and where the ink stain still darkened the table. The meeting had the feel of a bargain brokered on the edge of a cliff. Perpétua was in the parlor that evening when Domingos arrived. She had set the candle to burn low and sat with an expression of expectation. She welcomed Domingos with the kind of civility that was beat into the social cloth of their class. Benedito was called in, his shirt still smelling of the day, his hands not steady but determined. The room felt like a scale. One pile would be their papers, the other, the mistress's silence and the price that could be exacted. Domingos spoke in the language of prudence. "I have looked at a sheet of possibilities," he said. "There is a way to quiet trouble. There is a cost. The question is whether you can pay it, and whether you would prefer disappearance or transaction." Perpetua's face tightened as if she had been prodded. Her pride was easier to bruise than her appetite. "Who speaks of disappearance?" she asked. "My house is orderly." Benedito placed, with the steadiness of a man who had rehearsed forever, the cabasa upon the table and opened it. The papers inside, folded letters, a draft of an alforia, notaries' names in a cramped hand, sat like small, terrible proof. He spoke then, not only of the documents, but of what had occurred. The demands, the midnight bargains, the way bodies had been used to keep accounts. He did so without flourish, like one reading an inventory. His voice did not shake. The room listened. Even the candle seemed to pause. Perpetua's color changed. Shock was not the word for what moved across her face. It was the fathomless flash of a ledger being read against a life. She rose then as if to reclaim something, and denied fiercely that she had ever traded a man's freedom for comfort. Her voice, previously measured, became a blade. She accused Benedito of slander. "You would make of my house a stage for rumor," she said, each word a castigation. Domingos, who had sat with the patience of a man placing bets, smiled without warmth. "Madam," he said, "the law is hungry for proof, and men are hungrier for stability. We may yet arrange an exchange that makes profit for you and quiet for those who fear your eyes. Or the papers may be dispersed, and scandal will do what it will." Perpetua did not drink the terms. She flailed with the only weapon she felt certain of, the rumor of the house's honor. "Do you threaten me?" she demanded. "I offer options," Domingos said. "You can buy silence with coins or with contracts, or you can put yourselves at risk." It was the first time any of them had heard Domingos speak like this, not merely as a scorer of sugar, but as a broker of human affairs. Benedito watched Perpétua weigh the choices: the mouth of the ledger, the hollowness of her future holdings, the fear of ruin. For the first time he saw her not merely as the woman who had pushed them at midnight, but as a creature who feared the collapse of her own fragile power. Benedito offered a final terrible bargain. He would hand over the drafts of Alforia. He had forged signatures enough to be persuasive, if Domingos guaranteed safe passage for those named. He did not ask for wealth. He asked for the shape of a future. He named Amaro, Geronimo, Joanna, Masu. He named himself. He asked for the cabasa to be promised a path, by which. A notarized paper, a small payment, a man in town who owed Domingos a favor. Domingos considered the list, his eyes moving slowly over each name. He calculated the cost of scandal against the opportunity of influence. Perpétua stood, and for the first time in memory, she looked broken in the face of consequence. She had the power to refuse and the power to bargain, both of which required her to acknowledge the ledger she had kept in one hand and the body in the other. The house had taught her cruelty, the paper taught her calculation. In the end, she did what she had always done, picked the choice that fed her fear. She turned to Domingos and, with a hand that trembled, asked him what he would ask in exchange. "What I ask," Domingos answered, "is that you allow me to place these men under contract at a sum I name, and that you accept an arrangement where paper is proof enough. You must pay a price. You must sign." Perpétua signed with the same hand that had once left a signature on her husband's ledger. The stroke was sure but small, a mark that would make a change. Benedito felt the world tilt in the way that a balance might tilt when a single heavy coin was laid down. He had risked everything: his voice, the cabasa, his memory of sorrows. The papers moved from the hollow of his keeps to the hands of a man who had deemed them currency. They left the house at dawn like exiles who had been given a map. The contract Domingos produced in the weeks that followed was careful and threaded through with subtleties. It was an agreement in which Perpétua would receive a payment, less than the market, but enough to assure her, while Domingos oversaw the transfer of manumission in a manner that would, on paper, appear legitimate. To Benedito, it felt like buying the right to breathe. To Perpétua, it was an attempt to sequester her power under a legal veil. The night of the exchange was small and solemn. They signed names, some real, some forged, and the notary's quill scratched an unfamiliar rhythm across the page. Benedito placed his mark as best he could. The smell of ink and citrus floated like a promise. Masu blessed the papers in the way his faith allowed, whispering the names of orishas to give the document a kind of protection beyond the law. Joanna held Benedito's hand as though to lend strength. Amaro's face was lined with the strain of hope. When at last the signatures were complete and the notary seal was placed, Domingos arranged for a small sum to be exchanged and for instructions to be given regarding the issuing of official alforias. Perpétua accepted her compensation with a face that neither rejoiced nor repented. The cabasa was lighter now, its burden passed into other hands. The morning they left the estate, the sky was a pale copper. The road ahead lay like a thin argument. It promised little but movement. Those who remained in the senzala watched from the low windows as the figures walked away. Benedito with a cabasa swung at his hip, Amaro with shoulders squared, Joanna beside him, Masu moving with a prayer on his lips. Geronimo walked more slowly, as if he carried a weight of memory that would not be shed even by a sea. Perpétua watched from the veranda, the ledger at her side, the hollow behind her eyes deeper than it had been. She had paid, in coin and calculation, for a peace that would still haunt her. They walked toward the river, where the ferryman waited with a thin smile and a list of names scratched upon his palm. The water was a dark ribbon, moving, listening. Benedito placed the folded paper, the final notarized instrument of their manumission, into his shirt, and let his chest feel, simply, that the world had shifted just enough. It was not a thunderous freedom. It was a slow, legal motion that promised new kinds of work and the thorn of new obligations. They were free by the letter of the law, and yet forever marked by the night that had pushed them. Memory, Benedito understood, was a thing that could be carried in a small cabasa as easily as an alforja. They crossed the river and did not look back. The plantation silhouette remained, a dark tooth against the horizon. Perpétua turned away and sat in her parlor with her ledger open. She felt smaller, not because she had lost power, but because power had exposed qualities she did not like in herself. The capataz continued his rounds, suspicious and adequate. Domingos, having brokered the deal, took his commission and, with a new kind of influence, began to arrange other trades. The system, as ever, adjusted its weights. In the years that followed, the paths of the freed men and women unfurled differently. Amaro found a job aboard a coastal brig where salt and wind reminded him of the life he'd always wanted. He wrote letters home that Benedito would read to Joanna when the road made her uncertain. Massu found a small community where his prayers and beads were more welcome, where a small grove became a place of peace. Geronimo took work in a city and learned to make a new kind of trade, but sometimes at night he still clenched his jaw and dreamed of the master's parlor. Benedito lived with the knowledge that the paper that had bought them out of the house had been a kind of violence in itself. He had had to bargain for dignity like a commodity. He thought often of the men whose names he had placed upon the document, and of the ones he had left unlisted because they could not be included. He wrote his story, carefully and with care, burying drafts in the cabasa and giving other copies to people he trusted. He taught others to read when he could, and so the letters multiplied like a small private tide. Perpetua's life, in the end, did not fit the neatness of villainy. She lived on, with a ledger and with grief, and in some quiet way she began to age into an opinion that power without love was a poor inheritance. She never sought forgiveness publicly. If she repented privately, it was in small manners. An extra ration left at the senzala door, a donation to the parish when storms took roofs. She was not absolved, nor was she condemned. Her conscience remained a complicated ledger, part arithmetic and part tender wound. There were stories, later, that painted the night in different colors. Some told only of Perpetua's cruelty. Others celebrated Domingos as a cunning liberator. Benedito's own account remained cautious, threaded with respect for the complexities. He knew, as did those who had followed him out into a world less ordered and more merciful in its own complicated measures, that freedom had been purchased at a cost that could not be easily measured. They learned to honor those costs by telling their stories, by teaching the children the letters that made choices possible, by naming the orishas and saints who had kept them company. Years on, when the river had moved much of the riverbank and the cane had been replaced in places by other crops, Benedito returned once to the edge of the plantation. He walked the path where the cabasa had been hidden and found the stump where Massu had once performed a ceremony. He laid his palm upon the worn wood and felt the memory pulse. Chains turned into papers, papers into road. He thought of Perpetua on her veranda, of Domingos who had been both benefactor and predator, and of the men whose names were inked upon paper. He thought finally of what the night had taken and what it had given. The hidden letter had revealed everything and had revealed little. It had been both proof and a blade. Benedito placed his hand upon his chest and felt the small bundle there. He had kept one copy of the original document, not for triumph but for memory. He was no longer a man who feared the night. He had learned to carry its lessons like a map. He spoke then, not loudly, for the river had ears but not judgment, words of thanks to Ogun and a soft petition to Shango. He folded the paper and placed it in the cabasa that remained, adding to it a coin and a bead. He set the cabasa into the earth and covered it with soil and prayers, as Massu had taught him, not to hide the truth, but to shelter it until young hands could dig it up and read the names out loud. And there, beneath the thin grass by the river, the papers waited, quiet witnesses to what had been endured and to what had been won. Them to the limit had also made the hidden letter bear witness. It had revealed, in its small plainness, that the world could be changed by ink and courage and the stubborn belief that a life could be more than a ledger's line. They left the estate not with fanfare, but with steps that knew one another. The river carried them away and kept the memory of their crossing in its long, tireless song.